Good evening. My name is Michael Bork, and I am President and CEO of the Mehmet Group. We are delighted to be the sponsor of this special video presentation here at a special bicentennial event of the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. The program you're about to see represents more than a quarter of our 200 years of statehood here in Maine. It features 7 unique individuals, all of who held the highest elected office in our state, and all of who cared deeply about making Maine a great place to live, work, and raise a family. They didn't necessarily agree on how to do it, and they all did it their own unique way. But in the end, we get to see outside of the harsh light of politics, the history that they all made because they care deeply about Maine and its people. I hope you enjoy this special presentation.
Maine is celebrating its 200th anniversary this year as a state. For our part, the Maine State Chamber has the wonderful privilege of interviewing and discussing with each of our 7 living governors their experience in office. At this time, our governor is Ken Curtis. Ken, it is a pleasure. So great to catch up with you again. At the ripe age of 35, you became our governor. I would guess that has to be the youngest governor in our history. If it's not, I can't recall it is. I've always been impressed with you as a person, but also your experience in our state, but also on the national level. We're talking that period of time between 1967 and 1975. A lot was going on. What was Maine like in that 8-year period?
Well, Maine was pretty much preoccupied with national things. Of course, we were in the middle of the Vietnam War. We had a Watergate scandal. A U.S. president resigned, and Senator Muskie of our own state, the vice presidential candidate for president.
When I think of your administration, I think of it with great admiration and the fact that so many of the things that you accomplished still live today. What occurred in those 8 years that you look back on with tremendous pride and say, boy, I feel good about that?
Well, of course, there were many things that were left undone. So, moving to some of the changes wasn't that difficult. But what was difficult was the Democratic governor dealing with the opposite political party in the legislature. And so it took quite a bit of doing to get both parties to work together. But I was so pleased that we were able to do that they cooperated, and then we got as much done for Maine as we did.
Do any examples of that come to mind that you were witness to people coming together or showing the best that they had?
It was amazing that Maine people would get behind and support a tax increase and saw the need to help the state and help the people in the state, and were willing to sacrifice what they appeared to be a sacrifice to help those people.
Yeah. The income tax, people may scoff at that, and they probably did at the time. I know they did at the time, but think of how that has served us today and what government would have been like without that rich source of revenue. And that was one of those things that had to be challenging at the time. And the fact that you could make that work with a Republican legislature is quite remarkable.
Well, I think what is remarkable is kind of the untold story, that the final bill that was adopted by the legislature was drafted by one of the leaders of the Republican Party. And some of the people in the legislature saw the need, and they cooperated very fully in the drafting of the bill, and were very quiet about their support.
Yeah. And your second term, the income tax was one of the primary issues that your opponent ran against you on, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, absolutely.
Yeah.
I ran for re-election 1 year after the income tax was adopted.
Bad timing.
I had won re-election by a very small margin. And of course, the income tax was voted 3-1 to keep. But Senator Muskie, a good friend, called me afterwards and said, how does it feel to know that a tax is more popular than you are?
A great story. What was one of your most proud moments or issues in that 8-year period that you recall?
Well, the thing that, as I look back on, which is I'm probably proud of, but it was really amazing that I was a Democratic governor, and for 8 years I was dealing with a Republican majority in the legislature. But there were so many things that needed doing, and I was so pleased to the attitude of a lot of members of the Republican Party. We found ways to work together and get things done that needed to be accomplished. And that's pretty remarkable in today's world to have two parties work together.
And with me today is the guy who introduced me to state government firsthand, Governor Brennan. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Good to see you again, Dana.
So let's talk about your term, 79 to 87.
Well, when I started, one of the big issues was the Indian land claims. The tribes were filing a claim against the state of Maine and maybe basically making a claim to about half the real estate in Maine because of a violation of the so-called Non-Intercourse Act of 1796, over 200 years ago. But it was a problem. A lot of people, their biggest asset is their home. And this kind of created a cloud on titles of real estate. Even people who are quite liberal and generous and ready for reparations, all sorts of things, weren't so sure anymore. The ongoing issue, though, was jobs, economic development. And early in our administration, we worked on creating the Finance Authority of Maine, which has played a real role in almost all economic development in this state since. So we worked on it, and I had an overall theme I felt strongly about, and probably people in Maine heard it ad nauseum. The best human service program is a job.
I use that even today. What would be one of your proudest moments, or what do you look to with pride of those 8 years that plays well in your mind?
Well, it's a lot of things, but it makes me think back the day I was getting through my 8 years. There was a headline in the Portland paper, Brennan leaving. Some probably said, thank God.
No.
But they said, the headline said, promises made, promises kept.
Oh, that's good.
4 words. That was powerful to me. I was very proud of things we did in education. But I was also proud of things like the state prison.
And would you say that that prison issue was one of the more difficult times?
That was difficult, but in another sense, it wasn't. I was familiar with what took place in Attica, New York.
Yes.
I said, it ain't gonna happen while I have responsibilities. That's why I took action. If you take somebody's liberty, you've got a responsibility to make sure they're protected in a jail. So we moved 150 state troopers into the prison, 2 o'clock in the morning, not a nice thing, to take command of the prison, to remove the fire dangers, to make sure we're in charge of our own prison, that inmates are properly protected. It's not glamorous, it's not exciting, it's not sexy, but it's things like that that have to be done. There were times, though, that you had to do certain things, and we just did them.
So are there any memories of those 8 years that you think about from time to time and it's simply you'd like to share?
Well, one of the more powerful memories in my campaigns, and I had a lot of them, I was in Belfast one day at a chicken factory. I was running for governor, which I did almost every 4 years for years. And a guy come out in an apron, kind of splattered with chicken blood and whatever else, and gave me $20 for my campaign. That was as touching and as moving as anything, knowing that that guy was making the minimum wage there, probably $4 or $5 an hour. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't much. $20, that represents a half day's work at least. It was so powerful because he believed in what I was saying. And that ties in with promises made, promises kept, important.
Governor, it's great to see you and welcome you.
Thank
You
you,
travel
Dana.
a lot. I never catch up, so this is a great
This is a good
to
opportunity.
do just that. 1987 to 1990, 95. Give us a glimpse into that period of time and what was happening in Maine.
I always say that it was sort of like Charles Dickens said at the beginning of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times.
Yeah.
And I say that because you'll recall that in the mid-1980s, the country as a whole was in a great growth mode. We had economic growth, we had low unemployment, we had jobs being created, incomes were rising, and Maine was benefiting from that as well. Well, 4 years later, the country is in a recession. And in the Northeast, it was the worst recession since the Great Depression. So we had to deal with the problems with having enough money to fund government, but at the same time make the investments in education and training, and also worry about the economy and the business climate. Fortunately, we made, I think, mostly good decisions that put us in a position so when we left, we had positioned Maine to take advantage of the recovery that would come in the late 1990s.
What would be a proud moment or initiative that you would share?
By the early 1990s, it was clear to me that the biggest issue impacting our business and job creation climate was our excessively expensive workers' compensation insurance system. And so we introduced legislation to change our system to bring our costs in line with what businesses in other states were paying. That was rejected by the legislature. And so we had a 13-day government shutdown.
Yeah.
And that was painful. And it was sort of the most painful time professionally that I was governor to go through that, mainly because if you think about it, a government shutdown is basically an admission by the elected leaders of the state that they can't accomplish what the people elected them to do. And no one wants to be in that position. But we felt that we were in a position where in order for Maine people to get the kind of quality of life and the standard of living and the jobs that they deserved, we had to do something about this system. And the shutdown called enough attention to the problem that we were able to form the bipartisan Blue Ribbon Commission to make recommendations on how to reduce our workers' comp costs. It was a huge success. And thanks to the chamber and businesses and individuals across the state, they convinced the legislators to finally pass that legislation and to create the Maine Employers Mutual Insurance Company.
Exactly.
And that was really important because it gave us a Maine insurer who was going to make sure that Maine workers were protected from workplace injuries, but also we're going to do it at an appropriate cost for businesses so they could compete.
What was your most difficult time, and did the people of Maine help during that time, or how did you get through it?
It was 1991 when my son died. And from a personal standpoint, parents neither expect nor are prepared for a child dying. And what really got me through that time was the outpouring of support for people all across the state. And it just was very comforting, and especially the dozens of letters that I received from parents who had also lost children. Because that helps you understand that you're not the only one who's had to endure this tragedy, that others have gone through it as well. And their experience were really helpful. And I really was moved by the way people responded. It shouldn't have been a surprise to me because 4 months after I was sworn in as governor, we had the worst flood of the Kennebec River in 50 years. And I can remember being on the banks of the Kennebec in Augusta and Hallowell, helping people fill sandbags to protect businesses and homes. And 2/3 of the people there didn't even live in Augusta or Hallowell. And it was just the way Maine people are in reaching out to people in difficult times.
But is there another example that you had the occasion to see the best of Maine people?
Well, when I was first running, I talked about two Maines, having grown up in Bangor. And when I would go to these capitals for a day, as an example, I mean, there would be people who would say they have never had government come to their community before, and they would take you to the kind of things that they're doing. And when you look at what's taking place, especially in rural parts of the state where there isn't as much government, and I would see, the caregivers who were taking care of family members or neighbors. And that's the thing that always struck me. I mean, Maine is just a wonderful place. I used to say to people, look, we can't help it, we're from Maine, just people are just better here. and all you have to do is see how people care for their neighbors to understand that it really is something that's unique and special about Maine.
Welcome, Angus King. I should be referring to you as Senator, but we're going to go back to 95 and 2003, and we're going to share the experiences. Tell us what was Maine like in that 8-year period as the century changed from one to the other.
Well, it was a period of great transition. First, I came into an economic recession. The national recession, 1991, 92, 93. There was a big budget deficit to start with, and we were cutting agencies and taking a lot of flack. And all of that period informed the beginning. But it was also a period of national transition. I remember Dana being sort of shoved out into the cabinet room to announce Maine's first ever website. And I really wasn't sure what I was announcing. That was in the early spring of 1995. So through that period was the internet really got its beginning. There were a lot of changes in the Maine economy. We were seeing the decline of some of the old traditional industries, rise of new industries, rise of the new financial sector, services sector, telecommunications, all those things.
What was some of your most proud moments during those 8 years?
Well, there were. I was thinking. I was at the 20th anniversary of the Maine Technology Institute, which has been a huge part of the Maine economy for 20 years, and that's a very proud part of what we did. And we knew that we wanted to put more state money into R&D, but we weren't sure how to do it. So Maine Technology Institute was a big deal, and it's still going. Another similar example was in the first 2 or 3 months, and I'm sure you remember this. We started the Maine International Trade Center. The concept of the Maine International Trade Center was to be the VP of international marketing for small businesses. And lo and behold, it's still going. The legislative leaders came to me and said, Governor, we don't think we can do this statewide. Let's do a couple of pilot programs. And I said, no, if we can't do it for everybody, let's not do it. Because access to technology was part of the idea, but equity was the other part. I wanted the kid in Fort Kent or Meadowbanks or Calais to have the same opportunity as the kid in Cape Elizabeth or Falmouth or Augusta.
What do you recall as the most difficult or one of the most difficult, and how did people of Maine really help in that respect?
Well, there were two that jump out at me, September 11th and the ice storm. September 11th, I was at a meeting in the office at 8 o'clock in the morning. Like most people, I'd heard about a plane hitting the World Trade Center on the way, and I figured it was a small plane. And K-RAN knocked on the door and said, a second plane has hit the Pentagon, Governor, we're under attack. And the next came was an incredible 24 or 48 hours. I immediately stood up from the meeting. We evacuated the State House and the State Office building. My concern was that we didn't know what the scope of this attack was, and that they might want to hit state capitals just to show they could, to demoralize us. That was the whole purpose of September 11th. So we evacuated the State House and State Office building. There was an underground sort of command center at Camp Keys here in Augusta. And that's where I went, and the cabinet. One of the things we learned, Dana, was cellular phones didn't work down there. We fixed that. If you remember, the FAA grounded every plane in America. Well, it was September. September's forest fire season in Maine, and the way we hunt for forest fires is by flying airplanes. So I spent a lot of time on the phone with the FAA in Boston trying to persuade them to let us put our firefighting planes up so that we didn't have a catastrophe in the Maine woods. The other thing was we spent a lot of time saying, can we help? Communicating with the people in New York. Can we send people, doctors, nurses? We were being flooded with people who wanted to help. The ice storm, of course, was an incredible challenge.
Yes.
Probably the greatest natural disaster to ever hit Maine. And I remember touring MEMA, the Maine Emergency Management, very early in the first months. And I thought, well, here's a place we can cut. Why are we spending all this money for these people preparing for emergencies? Boy, was I wrong. I mean, the ice storm came, we had an infrastructure set up, we had communications throughout the state, We had availability of cots and shelters and all of those things. There weren't enough state troopers, sheriffs, local emergency people to reach out to individuals in their homes who might be in trouble. So we got on the radio and said, okay, folks, it's neighbor to neighbor. Go knock on the door of the person next door, particularly if they're disabled or elderly, and make sure they're okay. It really was, in a sense, Maine at its best. Maine was tested that week, and it passed. I always say in Washington, they say, why do you like Maine so much? I say, it's a big, small town with very long streets. We still know each other and care about each other.
With Governor Baldacci, a real pleasure, my friend.
Great to see you, Dana.
2003, 2011. Give us a glimpse into those 8 years, what it was like, what was going on in Maine.
We had a $1.3 billion structural gap, highest tax burden in the country, paper mills closing. It was a challenging time.
And in spite of that economy, you've got a lot of things to look to that you should feel very proud of to be a
Well, I
part
think the fact that we confronted the deepest recession since the Great Depression, and we were able to be able to put forward shared sacrifices, knowing that we're all going through these tough times, but we're going through it together. And to be able to also invest in education and research and development. So we just didn't balance the budget, but we invested to grow in the importance of doing it. And growing up in a large family, as I did, you know, you learned early not to take credit for too many things because you had 7 other brothers and sisters who were ready to take the air out of you. So you work as a family, you work as an extended family, as a team, and you get things done.
And you know what? I need to remind people that you did that without raising taxes.
Well, we had the highest state and local tax burden in the country, and we weren't going to raise taxes. Yeah. You know, we privatized liquor, you know, provided the state an opportunity to use it as a vehicle to pay down the debt at hospitals or the state, or to balance the budget without raising taxes. You know, we accomplished those kinds of changes in state government that were important. We consolidated departments and agencies. And we needed to do it. We needed to cut the waste and the duplicate nature of government and make sure that we had money to invest in education and healthcare.
And speaking of healthcare, your efforts to help the people of Maine through the program DIRIGO Health was something that came to life during that time when most would think that with all the issues at hand, how is that possible? But you did it.
We didn't start it as big as we wanted to start it, but we wanted to start it because I didn't want people to go on Medicaid to get their health care. I wanted to reduce those costs, but we needed to have an insurance product because they couldn't afford it otherwise. So we created DIRIGO, which was a quality health program supported by Harvard Pilgrim, and I worked with Governor Baker at that time. And we provided a vehicle for people who were working to pay half of their premium if they pay the other half. So it kept them working and kept good workers at businesses, which enabled them to be thriving and stay with their families.
I was interviewing Governor McKernan a while ago, and we were talking about workers' comp. And I know you, as a legislator at the time,
Right,
kind of stepped aside from the party to work with the administration on something that today still bears fruit and was so significant to our economy then, but also now.
Dana, we had insurance companies who were not doing business with Maine businesses, so businesses couldn't operate if they didn't have workers' comp insurance. The premiums were outrageous, so workers weren't being hired. We had a government shutdown going on. I thought it was imperative that I get involved and work with Governor McKernan in his administration to do what I could do to see if we could come to a compromise and help. And through the work that all that was done, I feel very proud about what we ended up having. We created Mimic, and it's one of the most success stories I think we've had, but it's working together and developing those relationships.
Absolutely.
We have too many administrative chiefs, and we don't have enough resources. That's Maine's challenge, how to make local control work without having so many different administrative structures and expensive salaries and benefits to pay for. Because our people earn below the national average, but the expenses are above the national average. And the only way we're going to control property taxes and taxes in general is to be more efficient, which every Mainer does every single day of their lives.
Governor LePage, thank you so much for being
Pleasure
here.
to be here.
Yeah. 2011, 2019, those 8 years. Tell me what was going on. What was important in those years?
We were still, suffering from the Great Recession.
Recession.
Here in Maine, I used to say, and I campaigned that it was a depression because it was really hit us particularly hard. I mean, unemployment was over 8%. We owed hospitals $750 million. We weren't able to pay. Taxes were the second highest in the country. And so I was in a period where we had to reinvent ourselves. And I think we did a pretty good job. I mean, I left in January of 2019. Unemployment was at 2.7%, number 2 in the nation, lowest in the nation. And the economy was good. The rainy day fund was high. We lowered our taxes. So I think we've made a good rebound.
So what, in your moments of reflection, would you say you're most proud of?
Having paid off the hospitals, I think, is probably the biggest thing I'm proud of. We not only paid off the $750 million we owed the hospitals in Maine, which was off balance sheet, but we were able to lower taxes at the same time. And that was because we brought back the liquor business that was leased out for 10 years. When that expired, we brought it back in-house, and instead of making $10 million a year, we make $55 million a year.
You were very passionate and very persuasive about your concern with not just the elderly and the disability of people, but also domestic violence. You came
Domestic
on
violence,
that issue
and if you
very
see,
strong.
I still wear the bracelet. Came from a very dysfunctional family and where domestic violence was prominent, and left home at 11. So yes, I live and breathe that every day.
You have faced challenges all your life, and as a matter of fact, challenges that would have defeated most people.
It's funny, but my youth was very challenging. But in my business career, 20 of the 40 years in business was doing turnarounds for troubled companies.
Yeah.
So, frankly, it was not a surprise that we were able to do what we did in the state because I was experienced. I had 20 years experience in turning ailing companies around. And frankly, the government is not that dissimilar. Interesting, the healthcare front. We implemented a healthcare program in 2011. In 18 months, we were lowering the premiums as much as 69% in Aroostook County and around the state.
What was your most difficult time in those 8 years?
For 8 years, if you read all the articles that were written about me in the state of Maine press, for 8 years, I could not do anything right. And that was hard to take.
What would be the moment in which, in those 8 years, you saw Mainers at their very best?
You know, there were so many times. The one thing that we did in our administration is I'd open the office up between Labor Day and Memorial Day. Every Saturday morning, 8 to 12, I'd go in and people could come in and see me. And that's when I saw some of the best action, the best ideas come from Maine people. It never came from me, it didn't come from my staff. Much of what we did came from Mainers coming to visit with me and giving me suggestions. A 9-year-old comes to visit me with his grandmother on Saturday morning. He's 9 years old. And he says, my mom and dad are divorced, and every other week, I got to go visit my dad. He says, and he's pretty rough on me. He says, but I don't mind it. He said, I can take it, but my little 6-year-old sister can't. We took care of that problem Monday morning.
Every year, we come here as a state chamber to hand out scholarships to young people through the JMG program. Talk about your commitment to that.
It's about education, and in the 8 years I was governor, we already said my start was a little rough, but there's only one way to get out of poverty, and that's with an education and a good job. It's not going to be the government. And JMG has done such a great job, and it grew while I was governor, and I'll tell you, it should not stop until every child has an education.
And we are grateful, Governor Mills, that you're here with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah. As you think of our bicentennial, what's brought us here, Why is celebrating that bicentennial so important? What's so special about Maine that we should spend that time and that effort?
I think the bicentennial is bringing all kinds of people together and demonstrating the sense of community that we have all over the state of Maine, and the fact that we're evolving. We're celebrating the people and what we bring together. And that means also welcoming new people to the state of Maine, as we have in the past.
I can't help but remember at the inauguration when one of the first priorities you established was climate change. And then you stood before the United Nations and made Maine a leader in that effort.
I think a lot of the issues that we're talking about these days, that I'm talking about and my administration are talking about, are issues that have been brought to the fore in great part by the younger generation of Mainers. I see students every day, I see young people, working people, academics, and they're out there on these issues. The other issue is healthcare that we've worked on, and the opioid epidemic. And in the effort to revitalize and preserve our coastline, addressing the issue of the rising seas and warming ocean, it's a challenge.
Yeah.
It's a long-term thing.
But I don't want you to lose note or lose focus in terms of what you as the first female governor does in terms of inspiring young women across our state and around the nation. Speak to that. That's quite an honor, quite an achievement.
Well, it's a privilege. I feel like I'm the luckiest person in the world. I really am. To be a leader in my home state of Maine, a state that I love more than anything, a state with 4 fulsome seasons and incredible natural amenities and incredible people. In terms of being the first woman governor, it's not about me. It's about the kids I get letters from every day. The little girl, 8 years old, who wrote me on Inauguration Day, who said, "Dear Governor Mills, now I know that I can be governor someday too."
That's nice. That's
Very
inspirational.
nice.
Yeah.
Very nice.
In the year that you have served, almost a year, share with us a difficult time that you had and how you kind of got through it, and did the people of Maine help in that regard?
Every day is a pleasure in my life to go to the office and do things for the people of Maine, but of course, the explosion, the tragic event in Farmington was a terrible thing to deal with. People I knew were involved in that. The firefighters of Farmington, Maine, the greater Farmington community is all impacted by that trauma, that tragedy. So, but it brought a lot of people together across the state. One of the more difficult issues I've had to deal with in the legislature, and there have been many, we've dealt with health care, with firearms legislation, with climate change, but the Death with Dignity bill was a tough one. And I met with people on all sides, from the hospice community, caregivers, and religious leaders, and eventually decided to sign the bill into law, but with some caveats, with an executive order to try to protect people whose liberties might not be well respected in this process. So it was a tough one philosophically and legally.
And what would you say would be an example in your time that would put on display that best of Maine people?
I think kicking off the bicentennial has brought people together and started thinking about themselves as a state again, as a whole community, not just pockets of neighborhoods in different industries or silos. And I think one of the objects of a leader is to break down the silos across the state, silos of communications, silos of education, silos of industry. Make sure people are talking to one another across the aisle and working with one another across the state. We're a whole people. I think we have a lot in common, much more in common than we have that separates us. Maine is one state, not a state divided, but a state united. Even though we have varying opinions, varying approaches to things, but we're united in many ways.
You must have had a place that you'd like to escape to. Was there a favorite place?
Yes, the driving range at Augusta Country Club.
You can't beat looking out at Poland Harbor, the beautiful islands, the promenade. And it's, to me, that's my special place.
Well, really, southern Maine and the southern Maine coast became our home. When we wanted to get away from the Blaine house, we would simply go to a home that we owned in southern Maine.
There's so many spectacular places.
The natural beauty that we have here, whether it's our farmlands or our forests or our parks or our mountains or our lakes, rivers, streams, the iconic coastline. When I stand on the town dock and look across Frenchman Bay that's sort of gleaming and see the Porcupine Islands and Bar Harbor and Cadillac Mountain in the background.
My favorite spot in the state of Maine, bar none. My whole life, not just when I was governor, but my entire life has been Aroostook County.
Oh, nice.
I think Madawaska, Frenchville, St. Agatha region is still very French, and I just love going there.
Recently, Mary and I went camping. We went to some new places for us. We went to Solon, Maine, up on the
Yes,
Kennebec, at a
absolutely.
wonderful campground right on the river. And then we went from there over to Mount Blue State Park in the RV and stayed up there. Absolutely spectacular place.
What is your favorite place?
I have several favorite places. I love Stonington. My grandfather and his parents and grandparents were from Stonington. And I like Clearwater Lake. I have a camp on Clearwater Lake, and that's where I go a lot on weekends and hang out with friends and just be there. Watch a beautiful sunset.
You can throw a dart at Maine and find great people and cool stuff to do.
I mean, it is unbelievable the natural resources that we have been blessed with.
Is there anything that you would advise future leaders, those words of wisdom that you would say to them, this is what I have learned or observed that you should be aware of if you become governor? What would that be?
Well, it would be to look at things not from a partisan perspective, because government operations are more for an engineering and efficiencies in getting things done. It's not political in a sense. You're an executive of a department overseeing a lot of different workers and different divisions.
I think it behooves every new governor to find out as much as possible where the state's heading, where the nation is heading, and how to develop their programs and streamline their programs to meet the needs of the state as they exist at the time, but more so as they exist in future years. We have to try to keep up.
What would you advise your future leaders?
Listen to the other side before you make decisions.
Because you're going to be judged on whether it's done or not whether it's done by a Republican or a Democrat.
Listening to the people. Whether you agree with or disagree with everything that is said, be sure to listen and learn from history.
What would be your words of wisdom? What would be your advice to future leaders as they take on the job of governor?
Don't lose sight of the core assets that Maine has. Forests, the ocean, and the people. And you put all those together and it gives us a huge opportunity, if not advantage, but an opportunity going forward.
I would tell the future leaders of this state that you've got a gold mine, use it properly. Be good to the environment, be good to the industries in which you're in.
Maine's ace in the hole is its quality of life.
Politics and governing isn't all about issues or laws or regulations or mandates. It's about relationships and relationship building.
It's important for leaders to ensure that Maine people understand that we are blessed to live in Maine, not burdened by it. And we have enormous opportunity, and we just have to set our sights as high as our dreams will take us and realize that it's within the reach of Maine people. History is replete with the people from Maine who have made an enormous difference in this country.
All of us were very privileged in 200 years to serve as the office of governor. And it's a unique office where people do have an opportunity to try to make a difference.